Great. Well, thank you, Iris. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks to everyone else. As Iris mentioned, or maybe not, but I've worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 14 years now, and most all of that has been with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which I'll talk about shortly. Then here a few months ago, I was voluntold, I don't know if this has happened to anyone in this room, to participate in this group here and represent the service on the steering committee. And I said, well, the rights of way is habitat. What is this? So, but the more I got to talking to Iris and thinking about the potential on the landscape and talking to different folks, the more excited I got about this role. So as much as I'm interested in talking about the Fish and Wildlife Service with you, I'm also interested in learning from you what you all need from the Fish and Wildlife Service, how myself and our other staff members can contribute, because it looks like there's a lot of energy in this room. So thank you for the opportunity to teach me about what you all are working on as well. So I have a bunch to talk about as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service and update you on a few things. Oh, that goes really, that's really sensitive. There's the whole top presentation. Thank you. This isn't news to most people probably, but just thought I'd start with briefly where we are with the monarch population. And this is looking at the wintering population in Mexico, looking at the eastern population with the updated figures from 2017-18 winter. So we were at about 6 acres, which is still down from the last couple of years, and still evaluating what might have caused that. But certainly there was substantial storm as they were leaving their wintering grounds last year that likely contributed to some of that. So lots of work to do. And the western population, similar declines. And I guess what's important to note there is in the west, how we're counting populations, we're actually trying to estimate the number of individuals versus the area that they occupy. And we're also putting a lot more effort into monitoring. So you can see the number of sites that have been monitoring, that we've been monitoring has gone up. So that's just giving us more certainty that there is a significant decline in the western population as well. And we've been talking a lot about the listing decision coming up. So where we are in this flow chart, obviously we've been petitioned, and right now we're working on a few things. We're working on a species status assessment to respond to that petition and get a scientific assessment of where the population is. We're also working on a CCAA, which we'll talk about, and that's all in anticipation of a listing decision next year. And the other component of that may have just been released today. I'm not sure. If not, will be soon. Is our Monarch Conservation Effects database, where we're trying to compile all of these efforts that groups here are doing, that ag groups are doing, private lands, everything, so that we can have as good a basis for our decision as we can. But the goal that's been developed by us and by lots of other stakeholders is to get back to about 15 acres for the eastern wintering population, which would require up to 1.8 billion stems of milkweed on the landscape. You all have probably heard some of these figures, and we're still working on some objectives, some population goals for the western population. But for some context, that population has been as high as 10 million butterflies. So we're really billing this as an all hands on deck approach, not just rights of way, but we're working with the ag sector, lots of other people. We're pulling in as much science as we can to justify and back up whatever decisions we make. And to the extent possible, we want to do this collaboratively, and we don't want to use the stick approach or whatever you want to call it. We want to do this in a spirit of partnership with you all and lots of other people. And really, I think that that's been going pretty well. So lots of work to do, but that's how we're looking at it. So one of the big efforts that we'll talk about here today, we'll talk about tomorrow, is the CCAA, and I know lots of people in the room are involved with that effort. In case there isn't, CCAA is a voluntary agreement that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses for petitioned or other at-risk species. Whoever's signing that agreement then basically gets some assurance that management that they are doing can continue without further regulation once a species is listed. So it's a way to do some proactive voluntary conservation and get some assurance that what you're doing you can continue doing if a species is listed. We've done several CCAAs over the years, and I think we are learning more as we do each one, learning that they have to work with whoever the cooperator is that will be signing this, that it has to be seen as an incentive, it has to be user-friendly, and certainly that's the direction we want to go with this CCAA. So, you know, like I just mentioned, there's benefits to the property owner that your contributions to conservation are memorialized, and that there is some regulatory certainty. And of course, for the species, those agreements are written directly to address threats to that species. So, so it is a tool used to improve habitat on the landscape, and we have, and other agencies and other organizations have lots of incentive programs out there to assist landowners to put habitat on the ground, whether for a CCAA or not. So here this afternoon, like I said, you'll hear more about the CCAA from Iris and I believe Dan. And I want to make sure I introduce Laurel Hill. Just recently, were you voluntold as well, Laurel? Enthusiastically. Yes, no, Laurel has just recently taken on the role to represent the Fish and Wildlife Service and be the lead for the Fish and Wildlife Service on this Monarch CCAA. So I know that some of you have already worked with Laurel, and yeah, she'll be fantastic in that capacity. So, couple other things I wanted to mention, just some of our other monarch conservation efforts. One of the things that we've invested a lot of time and resources in is with our partners convening different summits in several states. I work for the Midwest region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, but here I'm representing the agency nationally. But that's why you'll see some Midwest focus in what I'm talking about. But some of these summits have resulted in bigger partnerships and bigger initiatives. In Missouri, for example, they convened maybe representatives of 60 or so different organizations, and it turned out everyone was so excited that they wanted to put in money to hire a coordinator, and that summit grew to an existing organization called Missourians for Monarchs. Similar with the Ohio Pollinator Habitat Initiative, OP-HI, one of our summits just sort of began this partnership that took a life of its own. And we're in different stages of convening these summits in different states. A really good example of a statewide partnership is our Iowa Monarch Consortium, and this group gathered all of these sector representatives together and took a step down from our national goals and basically came up with acreage goals with real numbers for all of these different sectors in the state. And this was bought into by representatives from all of the sectors you see here. So a very collaborative approach, very all hands on deck approach that everyone's bought into. So that was just recently announced, and they got some awards for their efforts there in Iowa. And we're also doing a lot of work with the agricultural sector, as Chuck mentioned and others have mentioned. We work with corn growers associations, soybean growers associations, different cattlemen's associations. Of course, we have the Keystone Monarch Collaborative that convenes a lot of those groups into one collaborative, similar to the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. We work with producers on an individual basis. And the image you see here is a toolkit that Missourians for Monarchs produced, and it's a hard copy folder. Oh, not that image. Anyway, so it's a folder that has all these incentive programs, and we're handing that out to producers on the landscape to tell them all about monarch conservation and how they can contribute on their back 40 or on their, road right of way or wherever they have extra ground that can contribute. There's help out there to do that. And we're also, as far as science goes, we're picking up our monitoring effort. We did some pilot monitoring efforts in 2016 and 2017 and tested out some protocols, looking at private lands, looking at urban areas, looking at rights of way, and that effort will continue this year, looking at even more sites. So I think we're still getting some of the results in from those monitoring efforts. I'll just quickly mention some other species of interest, although there are a lot more out there. The rusty patched bumblebee, is, so a lot of you probably know, was recently listed, and it used to be a pretty wide-ranging species, so we're still evaluating what's going on there and recovery goals, but that's certainly a way that rights of way or other groups can participate. We're already starting to do lots of good projects for the rusty patched bumblebee. The frosted elfin is another pollinator, I believe. We have to make a listing decision out in 2023 for this one. Like a lot of these pollinators, a good diverse prairie with different nectaring plants is good for this one. It especially likes wild lupin and indigo. We have the yellow-banded bumblebee that we're also evaluating, that we were petitioned to list. And I believe later this year, we will come out with a proposal for this one. But similar to some of these others, it's not real specific for its habitat needs. As long as we have a good diversity of plants out there, a diversity of habitats, I think this one may like some savanna, open woodland habitat intermixed with some of these areas of native flowering plants. But like I said, we've been petitioned to list a lot of other species, so there are likely lots of others out there. Just a couple that we put together for today. So we're talking about challenges, we're talking about hurdles today. So agency-wide, we have several hurdles, challenges when we look at a landscape that we're trying to conserve, because we're charged with managing wide-ranging species. So, looking at land use change, invasive species, and we only directly manage a few small spots on the landscape with our wildlife refuges, and we do an excellent job with those wildlife refuges. But and a lot of these same challenges I know you all have with increasing population. We have to get infrastructure to those people and power and transportation, and we have to still find room for species on the landscape. So I wanted to talk about some other programs, some other things the Fish and Wildlife Service does beyond some of the regulatory things that we talk about a lot. We have what we call conservation delivery programs that are voluntary, they're proactive, and aren't really directly tied to our regulatory work. So the program I mentioned I work for is called Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and I've worked for this program my whole career as a biologist in the field, and now as a regional coordinator. And it was developed in 1987 to work directly with private landowners, and that means any landowner, non-state and non-federal, to do habitat restoration on their property on a voluntary basis. And it's pretty important that we look outside the boundaries of our own wildlife refuges to the rest of the landscape, which is mostly privately owned. And like I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service is charged with managing migratory birds, these listed species, all these wide-ranging species that, like a lot of other places than the lands that we own and we manage. So these are just a few tools that we've developed to take a more holistic look at the landscape. So with the Partners program, I mean, you only see sort of us and landowners in the picture, but we don't do any project without some partnership. Most of the time they involve Pheasants Forever, but also folks like Ducks Unlimited, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, NRCS. It goes on and on and on, and we end up with this cadre of biologists and folks that are on the landscape working with landowners, trying to guide them to the best program that will fit their needs and fit the objectives for their property. And they sign a 10-year agreement. We keep that as simple as we can. And we've had a lot of success with that program. We work with youth. We're doing a lot of pollinator habitat. We're doing a lot of wetland restoration. Whatever is sort of the limiting habitat for the species that we're after in a given part of the country. And we do projects on rights of way as well. A lot of these rights of ways, they're not owned by the state, they're not owned by the federal government, so they're private property, and therefore we can spend time with technical assistance, working with whatever partnership is on the ground there. Lots of our projects also involve financial assistance. Given the bureaucracy it takes to get some of those dollars, it usually makes sense for an individual landowner to get that financial assistance. If we're on some rights of way, it's generally more technical assistance, but we have put rights of ways into Partners for Fish and Wildlife agreements. And like I said before, I work for the Midwest region, so that's most of the data I have, but you could certainly expand this to the rest of the country if you had the data. But this is just a look at the 5-year period from 2012 to 2016, all the projects that we were able to do, again, with our partners, and we leverage our dollars as much as we can for the greatest impact on the landscape. One of our sister programs is called the Coastal Program, and obviously by its name, it's designed to work in coastal areas because coastal habitats usually have more of an intermingling of land ownerships, and it can be a little tougher to decipher who owns what on the coast. This program can work on public and private lands, but it has all of the same components as far as being voluntary and proactive. Each of these programs have developed focus areas on the landscape where we try to concentrate our resources. And this is just zoomed into one of those focus areas in the Saginaw Bay, and how we're viewing one of our focus areas. And we'll get into this detail and sit down with our partners and find what the limiting factors are in that focus area and where we should concentrate our resources. So lots of opportunity there. Here is just one particular coastal program project that happened to be right adjacent to a right-of-way. I don't know that this particular project included the right-of-way, but we had youth and community involvement. There's lots of PR for this project and volunteer labor and all this stuff, and it just represents an opportunity to include some of the rights-of-way landowners into these projects. And looking nationally, I mentioned that we try to identify focus areas on the landscape. I mean, these programs are pretty small. Partners for Fish and Wildlife is about a $50 million a year program nationally. Coastal program is maybe about $13 million. So we really have to think about where those resources go. So we sit down again with all those partners I mentioned, and we develop those focus areas where we're going to try to put those limited resources. And I guess what's important to me is that each of those focus areas represents a lot of energy, a lot of people at the table, a lot of landscape initiatives and opportunities to partner with whatever's going on in that focus area. And we're always evaluating those and refining those and trying to make sure that they describe what we see as the biggest need on the landscape and where there's a nexus with private lands. And I think, briefly, we also work with GLRI, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This is an EPA initiative, but we get dollars into the Fish and Wildlife Service to do partners work, to do coastal work. And just recently, we got support to do some pollinator work in the Great Lakes Basin. So we're going to be hiring a pollinator coordinator just to work on pollinator conservation in the Great Lakes Basin. So that person will be coming online very soon here. So there's lots more I could talk about with the Fish and Wildlife Service if you'd let me, but that's all the time I had on the agenda. I don't know if there's time for questions or if anyone does have questions. Okay. Thank you. Oh. The 50 million for the whole program, how does that? Right. So so each region gets an allocation. So I get an allocation as the regional coordinator, and then I allocate it out to each state. We try to base it roughly on those priority resources. So in the Midwest, we're looking at waterfowl, we're looking at T&E species, we're looking at other migratory species in decline, and we're looking at pollinators. So over time, we've just sort of developed, we've put bodies on the ground where we have the best opportunity to address those, and You know, I don't have a formula or anything. I base it on whatever's going on that year and where we have the opportunity and those partnerships built up. But we try as much as possible to base it on that, you know, that science and where we actually want to benefit those resources. It's a thinner and thinner pie to slice up.
Yeah. Thank you, Sergio. I have a question. The $50 million that's dispersed across the continental United States, I presume Alaska and Hawaii also, is that?
That's right.
Do you go out with RFPs to support your work, or is all this funding internally used?
We've tried to avoid official RFPs because we're not a granting program. We're a financial assistance program. Difference there is that we are intimately involved with any project we do. We call it substantial involvement. So our staff, our biologists, are substantially involved with each project we do. So given that, we try to, you know, still solicit for ideas through different avenues, whether it's presentations to landowner groups or partners or whoever, but we try to the extent possible to develop those project ideas in cooperation with one another, that rather than sending out an RFP. And that's sort of one of the things that we try to keep unique about that program. But we have I can get contact information. We have a coordinator in each state, and I can steer anybody to whoever that state coordinator is.